Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Now, as you know, this month on Pints with Jack, we are doing a poetry month. And my guest today is co-host to two of my favorite podcasts. Well, he's host and co-host. He is the co-host on the Literary Life podcast, and he is host of the Well-Read Poem podcast. So I'd like to welcome to the show the mysterious Mr. Thomas Banks. Welcome.
David, thank you for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
Well, would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit to our viewers? Who are you?
My main living I make teaching online at the House of Humane Letters, where I am a co-teacher with my wife Angelina Stanford. We've been teaching together since we got married 3 years back. We teach humanities, history, literature, and sometimes Latin online. So that's me. I write a bit. I can't say that I am a writer by vocation. I don't pay the bills that way, but I've published poems and essays and book reviews and things like that in a handful of small magazines, and yeah, so it's I guess you could say sort of a side gig.
Wonderful. Well, I invited you on to a Skype session today because when I've spoken to listeners and friends about this poetry month that we have coming up, the number of times someone has said to me, I haven't read poetry since high school, or I don't really get poetry. I don't understand the point. What am I meant to get out of this? And this is really why I wanted you on, because you have a podcast where you read poetry and break it down. And I thought you'd be the best person to really answer this main question. What is poetry and why does it matter?
So, what is poetry? Without giving a just kind of lame lexical definition, I would say that poetry is human language, formal human language raised to the maximal pitch of intensity and meaning, perhaps. It is actually kind of hard to define when you get right down to it, because we can't just say that poetry is language that rhymes, because a lot of languages poetry traditionally does not rhyme. I mean, you read the poetry of the Bible in Hebrew. I do not read Hebrew, but the Psalms do not rhyme.
No.
I mean, you read them in the King James, the Authorized Version, of course, they do not rhyme there either. They're non-metrical also. So the way Hebrew verse is structured, very different from English. Also, ancient Greek and Latin poetry, and I have studied the classics, and I can read some Latin pretty easily, and Greek not so much. But Greek is I fail to keep up with as well as I can. But if you read Homer, if you read Virgil, they do not rhyme either, though they are writing in what we recognize as formal meters. So defining poetry in technical terms can be a little bit difficult, but I guess you could say it's human language that I guess you could maybe exalted human language. Maybe that's the if I had to improvise, I might say something like that. I'm rambling now. You should probably have some signal worked out when you just cut me off.
No, I do like that. I like that definition, exalted human language, because we've had some conversations on the show already, because my co-host Matt doesn't do poetry. My other co-host Andrew and I have been trying to get him to love poetry for a while, and it has often come down to the question of, wait, does this count as poetry, or is this just a nice story that we've read, a nice description in a book which is otherwise you would call it prose? So with that beginning, why does it matter? Why should anybody read poetry?
I think if poetry, to look at it negatively, if poetry does not matter, I think other forms of human language, that just day-to-day conversation, prose, I think those forms of language, those uses of language tend to become debased also. So if poetry, which you might say is, words, words given, sort of the maximal degree of importance that can attach to human speech, if that, is simply a trivial or maybe an academic sort of exercise, I think it would be hard to argue that our other languages, uses of language, more utilitarian uses of language, really count for much either.
It reminds me of the line in the Dead Poets Society when Mr. Keating asked the class, why did language develop? And one of the kids picks up his hand and says, to communicate. And he says, no, to woo women.
I like that sort of answer. Yeah, that's, I haven't seen that movie in a long time, but I should watch it again, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think if we don't think about poetry, we don't really even think about language as being beautiful, and that it's then simply a means of communication. And Lewis has a lot to say on this when he talks about is theology poetry, and he speaks about the different modes of speaking. Sometimes a poetic mode will actually communicate more. Because you can whip up all of these other images and thoughts and emotions with the right choice of word.
I was going to say, Lewis also, I know, talks, I want to say this is in Preface to Paradise Lost. He does sort of blame the decline of interest in poetry on poets and critics of poetry themselves. I mean, the people who should sort of be, the natural guardians of the craft. He thought that much of the poetry in his own day, and he's writing in, he's doing most of his writing in the kind of the golden age of high modernism, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, Dylan Thomas, and those guys. He thought that poetry was ceasing to be a popular and really just kind of becoming almost a kind of hieratic or sacerdotal art where the priests were no longer ministering to the people and maybe seeing themselves as priests as part of the problem. And we're just kind of speaking in an arcane dialect to each other. That was a concern of his, I know, though I can't say I've studied that side of his mind very closely.
But have you read much of his poetry at all? Because I had many warnings over the years that I've been running this podcast about Lewis's poetry that it's not very good. But I've actually been reading it for the last couple of months, working my way through, and I've been very pleasantly surprised.
I wouldn't agree that it's not very good. I would say that his first book, actually, Spirits in Bondage, is a lyric cycle. It's a collection of poems he wrote mostly during. You have it right there. God bless you. Mostly during the First World War. I would say that if you open it up expecting to find the mature Lewis, the Lewis, the clubbable Church of England apologist, Lewis, sort of everyone's favorite Christian writer, you will not find him there because he's still young, atheistic, I would say very angry atheistic Lewis in this book, which I think he actually published under a pseudonym. I think he published it under his mother's name. Though I can't remember what it is. I don't have a copy.
It was Clive Hamilton, I think he published it
Clive
under.
Hamilton, that's right. That's what it was. And yeah, it's. I would say though, judging it by its technical merits, that Spirits in Bondage is a book worth reading. He's still a developing writer, and I would say he doesn't have. It's not maybe. Not maybe easy to distinguish from a lot of the other World War I poets like Rupert Brooke or Wilfred Owen. Say, I think it has. There's a lot of notes of other poets you hear there. I think there's. You can hear a bit of A.E. Housman, who would have been a generation older than Lewis, but he wrote a very popular work called A Shropshire Lad, using the same kind of simple ballad meters that Lewis uses a lot here. And there's also in both of them a very, very deep-seated, kind of angry pessimism. The kind of atheist who denies God and is arguing with him all at once.
Yeah, Lewis says that he didn't believe God existed, and he was very angry at him for not existing.
And you definitely see that in this book. I think, Lewis. Yeah, it's that sort of feeling is given articulate form and pretty violent form too. So yeah, like I said, it is a book worth reading if you can find a copy. I know you can find it online on archive.org. I've reread it there, or most of it to prepare for this. And I can't remember if it's even in print anymore, though.
This version which I just held up, this came out about a year ago, maybe 2 years, and I'm actually going to be interviewing Karen Swallow Price because she wrote the foreword to it. So we're going to dig a little
Oh, okay,
bit
very good.
into Spirits in Bondage because it is fascinating to read it, particularly if you've read a lot of other Lewis, because you come to this and some of the vocabulary is the same, but the meaning is different, and as you say, very, very
Hmm.
angry. Now, there you spoke about some of the poetic forms, like ballads, and you've got the sonnet and all of these other forms. Just in broad strokes, what actually are these forms, and what do they kind of bring to the text?
Ballad meter, what I referred to before, ballad meter is also referred to as common meter. In English poetry, that is a four-line stanza where you have alternating lines of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. So that would be a line of iambic tetrameter would be four iambic feet. So ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. That would be, and then the next line would be ba bum ba bum ba bum. Let me think of an example. Thomas Hardy, I went out to a coppice wood where frost was spectre gray, and all around was deadening on of winter's eye on day. I think I misquoted that slightly, but that's an example of ballad music. So a lot of hymns, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound to save a wretch like me. That would be an example of ballad meter. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that is one of the most common stanzaic forms in English. And then iambic pentameter. So you mentioned the sonnet. A sonnet is written in iambic pentameter, 14 lines, and there are two basic forms of sonnet. One of which originates in Italy, and it is often called the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet, where you have an octave, so an 8-line section, and then a sestet, which is a 6-line section, and the rhyme scheme generally is A B B A C no A B B A B B A C D E C D E. That's the Italian sonnet form. Then the other sonnet form, the Spenserian or Shakespearean, usually called the Shakespearean sonnet, or the English sonnet. There you have three quatrains, so three 4-line groupings and a couplet. That's
And are all of these forms? Is it like, kind of like music insofar as the sound just sounds good to our ears, and that's how that form effectively develops, and that's how you choose one form over the other?
Yeah, I don't know. Like there are, I mean, in English, so much of our poetry is written in iambic pentameter. I mean, our dramatic poetry also, Shakespeare's plays, unrhymed iambic pentameter, blank verse is what he uses. So yeah, there is something about that particular line form which is rhythmically pleasant to the ear of a English speaker. I don't know exactly how that came. I mean, it would be a very long story to describe how the iambic pentameter line kind of became the standard, dramatic and also epic line in English. John Milton writes Paradise Lost in unrhymed iambic pentameter, blank verse again. It's I guess something that's just sort of naturally inscripted on our hearts or something like that, or in our inner ear, the delight in that particular line.
Now, on your podcast, The Well Read Poem, you read a poem a couple of times and offer a little bit of commentary to help us understand it. Would you mind just picking a poem, any poem, and reciting a little bit to us?
Sure. Actually, since we've been talking about Lewis, let me pull one up here from Spirits in Bondage.
I will follow along.
So this poem, the title might seem a bit obscure at first. The title, Spirits in Bondage. This is the, let me see, fourth to the last poem in it. It's called Ne Quaesieris, which is a Latin title from the Roman poet Horace. And Tu Ne Quaesieris, which is taken from Horace's Odes, means roughly "you shall not ask" or "you should not ask." So, Tu Ne Quaesieris by C.S. Lewis. For all the lore of Lodge and Myers, I cannot heal my torn desires, nor hope for all that man can spare to make the riddling earth grow clear. Though it were sure and proven well that I shall prosper as they tell, in fields beneath a different sun, by shores where other oceans run, when this live body that was I lies hidden from the cheerful sky, yet what were endless lives to me, if still my narrow self I be, and hope and fail, and struggle still, and break my will against God's will, to play for stakes of pleasure and pain, and hope and fail and hope again, deluded, thwarted, striving elf, that through the window of myself, as through a dark glass scarce can see a warped masked reality. But when this searching thought of mine is mingled in the large divine, and laughter that was in my mouth runs through the breezes of the south, when glory I have built in dreams along some fiery sunset gleams, and my dead sin and foolishness grow one with nature's whole distress, to perfect being I shall win, and where I end will life begin. So in this poem, it seems that Lewis is in kind of a pantheistic mood. I mean, he is ruminating on the thought of his own death and what of him will survive, if anything, and seems to come to the conclusion that maybe he will be kind of something of him will survive in the great natural all, which is sort of a pantheistic conclusion. What consolation he derives from that, though, is maybe not something even he is fully convinced of. I don't know. This poem, he seems kind of uncomfortable here in his own thoughts in this poem. So, this is again Lewis writing as an atheist, but he doesn't seem altogether at ease with the sort of materialistic conclusions that he feels at the same time convinced of, which might explain his anger in some respects. And honestly, you maybe David know better than I do on this, but I don't think he really thought much of this book, even after just within a few years of writing it. I think he sends a letter. It's either to his father or his brother Warren, talking about how I'm more or less content that guys in my platoon didn't know that I had written this, and hence the pseudonym, because he was he maybe he should pursue other avenues. And it's maybe one could wish that he wrote more poetry, but he didn't have a high regard for his own abilities.
But I think regardless of how one views that, when you read his prose, I would say it's very poetic. You definitely get to see that there is a heart of a poet here. I'd say one of the strengths of his writing is that he has very careful choice of words. Even say if you read something like the Chronicles of Narnia, when I came back to them as an adult, I remembered more than was actually in the text, because I think he's just so good at evoking images in our minds, and we fill in much more of the details that he doesn't actually do.
And he had a very pictorial sort of mind to begin with. I think he said that he didn't really begin any piece of writing with an argument or with even a complete story in mind, so much as an image. And I think he said, what's it? Didn't he begin with Mr. Tumnus and the lamppost?
Yeah. When he was very young, he just had this image in his head, and he eventually found a vehicle for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's been lovely having you on the show, just to give us a bit of an intro to talking about poetry. Where can people go to find out more about what you and your good lady wife do?
You can go to our website, houseofhumaneletters.com, or you can listen to either of our podcasts, The Literary Life or The Well-Read Poem.
And if you like Lewis, they cover quite a few Lewis books, and he is very often one of their commonplace quotes, which is always lovely to see.
We're kind of junkies, yeah.
But
thank you again, David.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. And viewers, please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.